Chapter 13. The Masquerader. As Tarzan dropped to the ground beyond the temple wall, there was in his mind no intention to escape from the city of Allure until he had satisfied himself that his mate was not a prisoner there. But how, in this strange city in which every man's hand must be now against him? He was to live and prosecute his search was far from clear to him. There was only one place of which he knew that he might find even temporary sanctuary, and that was the forbidden garden of the king. There was thick shrubbery in which a man might hide, and water and fruits. A cunning jungle creature, if he could reach the spot unsuspected, might remain concealed there for a considerable time, but how he was to traverse the distance between the temple grounds and the garden unseen was a question the seriousness of which he fully appreciated. Mighty is Tarzan, he soliloquized, in his native jungle, but in the cities of man he is little better than they. Depending upon his keen observation and sense of location, he felt safe in assuming that he could reach the palace grounds by means of the subterranean corridors and chambers of the temple through which he had been conducted the day before, nor any slightest detail of which had escaped his keen eyes. That would be better, he reasoned, than crossing the open grounds above where his pursuers would naturally immediately follow him from the temple and quickly discover him. And so a dozen paces from the temple wall he disappeared from sight of any chance observer above, down one of the stone stairways that led to the apartments beneath. The way that he had been conducted the previous day had followed the windings and turnings of numerous corridors and apartments, but Tarzan, sure of himself in such matters, retraced the route accurately without hesitation. He had little fear of immediate apprehension here, since he believed that all the priests of the temple had assembled in the court above to witness his trial and his humiliation and his death. And with this idea firmly implanted in his mind, he rounded the turn of the corridor and came face to face with an under-priest, his grotesque headdress concealing whatever emotion the sight of Tarzan may have aroused. However, Tarzan had one advantage over the masked votary of Jad Ben Otho, in that the moment he saw the priest he knew his intention concerning him, and therefore was not compelled to delay action. And so it was that before the priest could determine on any suitable line of conduct in the premises, a long, keen knife had been slipped into his heart. As the body lunged toward the floor, Tarzan caught it and snatched the headdress from its shoulders, for the first sight of the creature had suggested to his ever-alert mind a bold scheme for deceiving his enemies. The headdress saved from such possible damage as it must have sustained had it fallen to the floor with the body of its owner. Tarzan relinquished his hold upon the corpse, set the headdress carefully upon the floor, and stooping down severed the tail of the hodon close to its root. Nearby at his right was a small chamber, from which the priest had evidently just emerged, and into this Tarzan dragged the corpse, the headdress, and the tail. Quickly cutting a thin strip of hide from the loincloth of the priest, Tarzan tied it securely about the upper end of the severed member, and then, tucking the tail under his loincloth behind him, secured it in place as best he could. Then he fitted the headdress over his shoulders and stepped from the apartment, to all appearances a priest of the temple of Jad Ben Otho, unless one examined too closely his thumbs and his great toes. He had noticed that among both the hodon and the wasdon it was not at all unusual that the end of the tail be carried in one hand, and so he caught his own tail up thus, lest the lifeless appearance of it dragging along behind him should arouse suspicion. Passing along the corridor and through the various chambers, he emerged at last into the palace grounds beyond the temple. The pursuit had not yet reached this point, though he was conscious of a commotion not far behind him. He met now both warriors and slaves, but none gave him more than a passing glance, a priest being too common a sight about the palace. And so, passing the guards unchallenged, he came at last to the inner entrance to the forbidden garden, and there he paused and scanned quickly that portion of the beautiful spot that lay before his eyes. To his relief, it seemed unoccupied, and congratulating himself upon the ease with which he had so far outwitted the high powers of Allure, he moved rapidly to the opposite end of the enclosure. Here he found a patch of flowering shrubbery that might safely have concealed a dozen men. Crawling well within, he removed the uncomfortable headdress and sat down to await whatever eventualities fate might have in store for him, the while he formulated plans for the future. The one night that he had spent in Allure had kept him up to a late hour, apprising him of the fact that, while there were few abroad in the temple grounds at night, there were yet enough to make it possible for him to fare forth under cover of his disguise without attracting the unpleasant attention of the guards. And two, he had noticed that the priesthood constituted a privileged class that seemed to come and go at will and unchallenged throughout the palace as well as the temple. Altogether, then, He decided night furnished the most propitious hours for his investigation. By day he could lie up in the shrubbery of the forbidden garden, reasonably free from detection. From beyond the garden he heard the voices of men calling to one another both far and near, and he guessed that diligent was the search that was being prosecuted for him. The idle moments afforded him an opportunity to evolve a more satisfactory scheme for attaching his stolen caudal appendage. He arranged it in such a way that it might be quickly assumed or discarded, and this done he fell to examining the weird mask that had so effectively hidden his features. The thing had been very cunningly wrought from a single block of wood, very probably a section of a tree, upon which the features had been carved and afterward the interior hollowed out until only a comparatively thin shell remained. 2 semicircular notches had been rounded out from opposite sides of the lower edge. These fitted snugly over his shoulders, aprons of wood extending downward a few inches upon his chest and back. From these aprons hung long tassels, or switches of hair tapering from the outer edges toward the center which reached below the bottom of his torso. It required but the most cursory examination to indicate to the ape-man that these ornaments consisted of human scalps, taken, doubtless, from the heads of the sacrifices upon the eastern altars. The headdress itself had been carved to depict in formal design a hideous face that suggested both man and Grife. There were the 3 white horns, the yellow face with the blue bands encircling the eyes, and the red hood which took the form of the posterior and anterior aprons. As Tarzan sat within the concealing foliage of the shrubbery meditating upon the hideous priest mask which he held in his hands, he became aware that he was not alone in the garden. He sensed another presence, and presently his trained ears detected the slow approach of naked feet across the sward. At first he suspected that it might be one stealthily searching the forbidden garden for him, but a little later the figure came within the limited area of his vision, which was circumscribed by stems and foliage and flowers. He saw then that it was the Princess Oloe, and that she was alone and walking with bowed head, as though in meditation, sorrowful meditation, for there were traces of tears upon her lids. Shortly after his ears warned him that others had entered the garden. Men they were, and their footsteps proclaimed that they walked neither slowly nor meditatively. They came directly toward the princess, and when Tarzan could see them he discovered that both were priests. "Oloe, Princess of Palul-Don," said one, addressing her, "the stranger who told us that he was the son of Jad Ben Otho has but just fled from the wrath of Ludon, the high priest, who exposed him in all his wicked blasphemy. The temple and the palace and the city are being searched, and we have been sent to search the forbidden garden, since Keotan the king said that only this morning he found him here, though how he passed the guards he could not guess." "He is not here," said Oloe. "I have been in the garden for some time and have seen nor heard no other than myself. However, search it if you will." "No," said the priest who had before spoken, "it is not necessary, since he could not have entered without your knowledge and the connivance of the guards, and even had he, the priest who preceded us must have seen him." "What priest?" asked Oloe. "One passed the guards shortly before us," explained the man. "I did not see him," said Oloe. "Doubtless he left by another exit," remarked the second priest. "Yes, doubtless," acquiesced Oloe, "but it is strange that I did not see him." The 2 priests made their obeisance and turned to depart. "Stupid as Buto, the rhinoceros," soliloquized Tarzan, who considered Buto a very stupid creature indeed. "It should be easy to outwit such as these." The priests had scarce departed when there came the sound of feet running rapidly across the garden in the direction of the princess, to an accompaniment of rapid breathing, as of one almost spent, either from fatigue or excitement. "Pan-at-Lee," exclaimed Oloe, "what has happened? You look as terrified as the dew for which you were named." "O Princess of Palul-Don," cried Pan-at-Lee, "they would have killed him in the temple. They would have killed the wondrous stranger who claimed to be the Doroloto." "But he escaped," said Oloe. "You were there. Tell me about it." "The head priest would have had him seized and slain, but when they rushed upon him he hurled one in the face of Ludon with the same ease that you might cast your breastplates at me. And then he leaped upon the altar, and from there to the top of the temple wall, and disappeared below. They are searching for him, but, O Princess, I pray that they do not find him." "And why do you pray that?" asked Oloe. "Has not one who has so blasphemed earned death?" "Ah, but you do not know him," replied Pan-at-Lee. "And you do," then retorted Oloe quickly. "This morning you betrayed yourself and then attempted to deceive me. The slaves of Oloe do not such things with impunity. He is then the same Tarzan Jad-guru of whom you told me. Speak, woman, and speak only the truth. Pan-at-Lee drew herself up very erect, her little chin held high, for was not she too among her own people already as good as a princess? Pan-at-Lee the Coral Jah does not lie, she said, to protect herself. Then tell me what you know of this Tarzan Jad-guru, insisted Oloe. I know that he is a wondrous man and very brave, said Pan-at-Lee, and that he saved me from the Toro Don and the Greif, as I told you, and that he is indeed the same who came into the garden this morning, and even now I do not know that he is not the son of Jad Ben Otho. His courage and his strength are more than those of mortal man, as are also his kindness and his honor, for when he might have harmed me, he protected me, and when he might have saved himself, he thought only of me. And all this he did because of his friendship for Omat, who is Gund of Coriul Jah, and with whom I should have mated had the Hodon not captured me. He was indeed a wonderful man to look upon, mused Oloai, and he was not as our other men, not alone in the conformation of his hands and feet or the fact that he was tailless, but there was that about him which made him seem different in ways more important than these. And supplemented Pan-at-Lee, her savage little heart loyal to the man who had befriended her, and hoping to win for him the consideration of the princess even though it might not avail him, and she said, did he not know all about Ta-Den and even his whereabouts? Tell me, O princess, could mortal know such things as these? Perhaps he saw Ta-Den, suggested Oloe. But how would he know that you loved T-Den, parried Pan-at-Lee. I tell you, my princess, that if he is not a god, he is at least more than Hodon or Wasdon. He followed me from the cave of Es-Satin Koril Jah, across Koril Lulul and 2 wide ridges to the very cave in Koril Greif, where I hid. Though many hours had passed since I had come that way and my bare feet left no impress upon the ground, what mortal man could do such things as these? And where in all Palul Don would virgin maid find friend and protect her in a strange male other than he? Perhaps Lu Don may be mistaken, perhaps he is a god, said Oloe, influenced by her slave's enthusiastic championing of the stranger. But whether god or man, he is too wonderful to die, cried Pan-at-Lee. Would that I might save him. If he lived, he might even find a way to give you your T-Den, princess. Ah, if he only could, sighed Oloe, but alas, it is too late, for tomorrow I am to be given to Beulah. He who came to your quarters yesterday with your father, asked Pan-at-Lee. Yes, the one with the awful round face and the big belly, exclaimed the princess disgustedly. He is so lazy he will neither hunt nor fight. To eat and to drink is all that Beulah is fit for, and he thinks of naught else except these things and his slave women. But come, Pan-at-Lee, gather for me some of these beautiful blossoms. I would have them spread around my couch tonight, that I may carry away with me in the morning the memory of the fragrance that I love best, and which I know that I shall not find in the village of Mosar, the father of Beulah. I will help you, Pan-at-Lee, and we will gather armfuls of them, for I love to gather them as I love nothing else. They were T-Den's favorite flowers. The two approached the flowering shrubbery where Tarzan hid, but as the blooms grew plentifully upon every bush, the ape-man guessed there would be no necessity for them to enter the patch far enough to discover him. With little exclamations of pleasure as they found particularly large or perfect blooms, the two moved from place to place upon the outskirts of Tarzan's retreat. Oh, look, Pan-at-Lee, cried Oloa presently, there is the king of them all. Never did I see so wonderful a flower. No, I will get it myself. It is so large and wonderful no other hand shall touch it. And the princess wound in among the bushes toward the point where the great flower bloomed upon a bush above the ape-man's head. So sudden and unexpected her approach that there was no opportunity to escape, and Tarzan sat silently trusting that fate might be kind to him and lead Kewatan's daughter away before her eyes dropped from the high-growing bloom to him. But as the girl cut the long stem with her knife, she looked down straight into the smiling face of Tarzan Jad-guru. With a stifled scream she drew back, and the ape-man rose and faced her. Have no fear, princess, he assured her. It is the friend of Tia-Den who salutes you, raising her fingers to his lips. Pan-at-Lee came now excitedly forward. O Jad Ben Otho, it is he. And now that you have found me, queried Tarzan, will you give me up to Lu Don, the high priest? Pan-at-Lee threw herself upon her knees at Oloe's feet. Princess, princess, she beseeched, do not discover him to his enemies. But Keotan, my father, whispered Oloa fearfully. If he knew of my perfidy, his rage would be beyond naming. Even though I am a princess, Lu Don might demand that I be sacrificed to appease the wrath of Jad Ben Otho, and between the two of them I should be lost. But they need never know, cried Panet Lee, that you have seen him unless you tell them yourself, for as Jad Ben Otho is my witness, I will never betray you. Oh, tell me, stranger, implored Oloe, are you indeed a god? Jad Ben Otho is not more so, replied Tarzan truthfully. But why do you seek to escape then from the hands of mortals if you are a god, she asked. When gods mingle with mortals, replied Tarzan, they are no less vulnerable than mortals. Even Jad Ben Otho, should he appear before you in the flesh, might be slain. You have seen Tay Den and spoken with him, she asked with apparent irrelevancy. Yes, I have seen him and spoken with him, replied the ape-man. For the duration of a moon I was with him constantly. And she hesitated, she cast her eyes toward the ground and a flush mantled her cheek. He still loves me, and Tarzan knew that she had been won over. Yes, he said, Ta Den speaks only of Oloe, and he waits and hopes for the day when he can claim her. But tomorrow they give me to Bulot, she said sadly. May it be always tomorrow, replied Tarzan, for tomorrow never comes. Ah, but this unhappiness will come, and for all the tomorrows of my life I must pine in misery for the Ta Den who will never be mine. But for Ludon I might have helped you, said the ape-man, and who knows that I may not help you yet. Ah, if you only could, Dorolotho, cried the girl, and I know that you would if it were possible, for Panet Lee has told me how brave you are, and at the same time how kind. Only Jad Ben Otho knows what the future may bring, said Tarzan, and now you two go your way lest someone should discover you and become suspicious. We will go, said Oloe, but Panet Lee will return with food. I hope that you escape and that Jad Ben Otho is pleased with what I have done. She turned and walked away, and Panet Lee followed while the ape-man again resumed his hiding. At dusk Panet Lee came with food, and having her alone, Tarzan put the question that he had been anxious to put since his conversation earlier in the day with Oloe. Tell me, he said, what you know of the rumors of which Oloe spoke, of the mysterious stranger which is supposed to be hidden in a lure. Have you two heard of this during the short time that you have been here? Yes, said Panet Lee. I have heard it spoken of among the other slaves. It is something of which all whisper among themselves, but of which none dares to speak aloud. They say that there is a strange she hidden in the temple, and that Ludon wants her for a priestess, and that Keotan wants her for a wife, and that neither as yet dares take her for fear of the other. Do you know where she is hidden in the temple? Asked Tarzan. No, said Panet Lee. How should I know? I do not even know that it is more than a story, and I but tell you that which I have heard others say. There was only one, asked Tarzan, whom they spoke of. No, they speak of another who came with her, but none seems to know what became of this one. Tarzan nodded. Thank you, Panet Lee, he said. You may have helped me more than either of us guess. I hope that I have helped you, said the girl as she turned back toward the palace. And I hope so too, exclaimed Tarzan emphatically. Chapter 14. The Temple of the Gryph. When night had fallen, Tarzan donned the mask and the dead tail of the priest he had slain in the vaults beneath the temple. He judged that it would not do to attempt again to pass the guard, especially so late at night, as it would be likely to arouse comment and suspicion, and so he swung into the tree that overhung the garden wall and from its branches dropped to the ground beyond. Avoiding too grave risk of apprehension, the ape-man passed through the grounds to the court of the palace, approaching the temple from the side opposite to that at which he had left it at the time of his escape. He came thus, it is true, through a portion of the grounds with which he was unfamiliar, but he preferred this to the danger of following the beaten track between the palace apartments and those of the temple. Having a definite goal in mind, and endowed as he was with an almost miraculous sense of location, he moved with great assurance through the shadows of the temple yard. Taking advantage of the denser shadows close to the walls, and of what shrubs and trees there were, he came without mishap at last to the ornate building concerning the purpose of which he had asked Ludon, only to be put off with the assertion that it was forgotten, nothing strange in itself, but given possible importance by the apparent hesitancy of the priest to discuss its use, and the impression the ape-man had gained at the time that Ludon lied. And now he stood at last alone before the structure, which was 3 stories in height and detached from all the other temple buildings. It had a single barred entrance which was carved from the living rock in representation of the head of a gryph, whose wide-open mouth constituted the doorway. The head, hood, and front paws of the creature were depicted as though it lay crouching with its lower jaw on the ground between its outspread paws. Small oval windows, which were likewise barred, flanked the doorway. Seeing that the coast was clear, Tarzan stepped into the darkened entrance where he tried the bars only to discover that they were ingeniously locked in place by some device with which he was unfamiliar, and that they also were probably too strong to be broken, even if he could have risked the noise which would have resulted. Nothing was visible within the darkened interior, and so, momentarily baffled, he sought the windows. Here also the bars refused to yield up their secret, but again Tarzan was not dismayed, since he had counted upon nothing different. If the bars would not yield to his cunning, they would yield to his giant strength if there proved no other means of ingress, but first he would assure himself that this latter was the case. Moving entirely around the building, he examined it carefully. There were other windows, but they were similarly barred. He stopped often to look and listen, but he saw no one, and the sounds that he heard were too far away to cause him any apprehension. He glanced above him at the wall of the building. Like so many of the other walls of the city palace and temple, it was ornately carved, and there were the peculiar ledges that ran sometimes in a horizontal plane and again were tilted at an angle, giving ofttimes an impression of irregularity and even crookedness to the buildings. It was not a difficult wall to climb, at least not difficult for the ape-man. But he found the bulky and awkward headdress a considerable handicap, and so he laid it aside upon the ground at the foot of the wall. Nimbly he ascended to find the windows of the second floor not only barred but curtained within. He did not delay long at the second floor, since he had in mind an idea that he would find the easiest entrance through the roof, which he had noticed was roughly dome-shaped like the throne room of Cayotan. Here there were apertures. He had seen them from the ground, and if the construction of the interior resembled even slightly that of the throne room, bars would not be necessary upon these apertures, since no one could reach them from the floor of the room. There was but a single question: would they be large enough to admit the broad shoulders of the ape-man? He paused again at the third floor, and here, in spite of the hangings, he saw that the interior was lighted, and simultaneously there came to his nostrils from within a scent that stripped from him temporarily any remnant of civilization that might have remained and left him a fierce and terrible bull of the jungles of Kerchak. So sudden and complete was the metamorphosis that there almost broke from the savage lips the hideous challenge of his kind, but the cunning brute mind saved him this blunder. And now he heard voices within the voice of Loudon he could have sworn, demanding, and haughty and disdainful came the answering words, though utter hopelessness spoke in the tones of this other voice which brought Tarzan to the pinnacle of frenzy. The dome with its possible apertures was forgotten. Every consideration of stealth and quiet was cast aside as the ape-man drew back his mighty fist and struck a single terrific blow upon the bars of the small window before him, a blow that sent the bars and the casing that held them clattering to the floor of the apartment within. Instantly Tarzan dove headforemost through the aperture, carrying the hangings of antelope hide with him to the floor below. Leaping to his feet, he tore the entangling pelt from about his head, only to find himself in utter darkness and in silence. He called aloud a name that had not passed his lips for many weary months. "Jane, Jane," he cried, "where are you?" But there was only silence in reply. Again and again he called, groping with outstretched hands through the Stygian blackness of the room, his nostrils assailed and his brain tantalized by the delicate effluvia that had first assured him that his mate had been within this very room. And he had heard her dear voice combating the base demands of the vile priest. Ah, if he had but acted with greater caution! If he had but continued to move with quiet and stealth, he might even at this moment be holding her in his arms, while the body of Loudon beneath his foot spoke eloquently of vengeance achieved. But there was no time now for idle self-reproaches. He stumbled blindly forward, groping for he knew not what, till suddenly the floor beneath him tilted and he shot downward into a darkness even more utter than that above. He felt his body strike a smooth surface, and he realized that he was hurtling downward as through a polished chute, while from above there came the mocking tones of a taunting laugh, and the voice of Loudon screamed after him, "Return to thy father, O Doroloto." The ape-man came to a sudden and painful stop upon a rocky floor. Directly before him was an oval window crossed by many bars, and beyond he saw the moonlight playing on the waters of the blue lake below. Simultaneously he was conscious of a familiar odor in the air of the chamber, which a quick glance revealed in the semi-darkness as of considerable proportion. It was the faint but unmistakable odor of the greffe, and now Tarzan stood silently listening. At first he detected no sounds other than those of the city that came to him through the window overlooking the lake, but presently, faintly, as though from a distance, he heard the shuffling of padded feet along a stone pavement, and as he listened he was aware that the sound approached. Nearer and nearer it came, and now even the breathing of the beast was audible. Evidently attracted by the noise of his descent into its cavernous retreat, it was approaching to investigate. He could not see it, but he knew that it was not far distant, and then deafeningly there reverberated through those gloomy corridors the mad bellow of the Gryph. Aware of the poor eyesight of the beast, and his own eyes now grown accustomed to the darkness of the cavern, the ape-man sought to elude the infuriated charge which he well knew no living creature could withstand. Neither did he dare risk the chance of experimenting upon this strange Gryph with the tactics of the Toro Don that he had found so efficacious upon that other occasion when his life and liberty had been the stakes for which he cast. In many respects the conditions were dissimilar. Before, in broad daylight, he had been able to approach the Gryph under normal conditions in its natural state, and the Gryph itself was one that he had seen subjected to the authority of man, or at least of a man-like creature. But here he was confronted by an imprisoned beast in the full swing of a furious charge, and he had every reason to suspect that this Gryph might never have felt the restraining influence of authority. Confined as it was in this gloomy pit to serve likely but the single purpose that Tarzan had already seen so graphically portrayed in his own experience of the past few moments. To elude the creature, then, upon the possibility of discovering some loophole of escape from his predicament, seemed to the ape-man the wisest course to pursue. Too much was at stake to risk an encounter that might be avoided, an encounter the outcome of which there was every reason to apprehend would seal the fate of the mate that he had just found, only to lose again so harrowingly. Yet high as his disappointment and chagrin ran, hopeless as his present estate now appeared, there tingled in the veins of the savage lord a warm glow of thanksgiving and elation. She lived. After all these weary months of hopelessness and fear, he had found her. She lived. To the opposite side of the chamber, silently as the wraith of a disembodied soul, the swift jungle creature moved from the path of the charging titan that, guided solely in the semi-darkness by its keen ears, bore down upon the spot toward which Tarzan's noisy entrance into its lair had attracted it. Along the further wall the ape-man hurried. Before him now appeared the black opening of the corridor from which the beast had emerged into the larger chamber. Without hesitation, Tarzan plunged into it. Even here his eyes, long accustomed to darkness that would have seemed total to you or to me, saw dimly the floor and the walls within a radius of a few feet, enough at least to prevent him plunging into any unguessed abyss, or dashing himself upon solid rock at a sudden turning. The corridor was both wide and lofty, which indeed it must be to accommodate the colossal proportions of the creature whose habitat it was, and so Tarzan encountered no difficulty in moving with reasonable speed along its winding trail. He was aware as he proceeded that the trend of the passage was downward, though not steeply, but it seemed interminable, and he wondered to what distant subterranean lair it might lead. There was a feeling that perhaps after all he might better have remained in the larger chamber and risked all on the chance of subduing the Gryph, where there was at least sufficient room and light to lend to the experiment some slight chance of success. To be overtaken here in the narrow confines of the black corridor, where he was assured the Gryph could not see him at all, would spell almost certain death, and now he heard the thing approaching from behind. Its thunderous bellows fairly shook the cliff from which the cavernous chambers were excavated. To halt and meet this monstrous incarnation of fury with a futile wee-oo seemed to Tarzan the height of insanity, and so he continued along the corridor, increasing his pace as he realized that the Gryph was overhauling him. Presently the darkness lessened, and at the final turning of the passage he saw before him an area of moonlight. With renewed hope he sprang rapidly forward and emerged from the mouth of the corridor to find himself in a large circular enclosure, the towering white walls of which rose high upon every side, smooth perpendicular walls upon the sheer face of which was no slightest foothold. To his left lay a pool of water, one side of which lapped the foot of the wall at this point. It was doubtless the wallow and the drinking pool of the Gryph. And now the creature emerged from the corridor, and Tarzan retreated to the edge of the pool to make his last stand. There was no staff with which to enforce the authority of his voice, but yet he made his stand, for there seemed naught else to do. Just beyond the entrance to the corridor the Gryph paused, turning its weak eyes in all directions as though searching for its prey. This then seemed the psychological moment for his attempt, and raising his voice in peremptory command, the ape-man voiced the weird wee-oo of the Toro Don. Its effect upon the Gryph was instantaneous and complete. With a terrific bellow it lowered its 3 horns and dashed madly in the direction of the sound. To right nor to left was any avenue of escape, for behind him lay the placid waters of the pool, while down upon him from before thundered annihilation. The mighty body seemed already to tower above him as the ape-man turned and dove into the dark waters. Dead in her breast lay Hope. Battling for life during harrowing months of imprisonment and danger and hardship, it had fitfully flickered and flamed, only to sink after each renewal to smaller proportions than before, and now it had died out entirely, leaving only cold, charred embers that Jane Clayton knew would never again be rekindled. Hope was dead as she faced Loudon, the high priest, in her prison quarters in the temple of the Gryph at Allure. Both time and hardship had failed to leave their impress upon her physical beauty. The contours of her perfect form, the glory of her radiant loveliness had defied them, yet to these very attributes she owed the danger which now confronted her, for Loudon desired her. From the lesser priests she had been safe, but from Loudon she was not safe, for Loudon was not as they, since the high priestship of Loudon may descend from father to son. Tarzan, the king, had wanted her, and all that had so far saved her from either was the fear of each for the other. But at last Loudon had cast aside discretion, and had come in the silent watches of the night to claim her. Haughtily had she repulsed him, seeking ever to gain time, though what time might bring her of relief or renewed hope she could not even remotely conjecture. A leer of lust and greed shone hungrily upon his cruel countenance as he advanced across the room to seize her. She did not shrink nor cower, but stood there very erect, her chin up, her level gaze freighted with the loathing and contempt she felt for him. He read her expression, and while it angered him, it but increased his desire for possession. Here indeed was a queen, perhaps a goddess, fit mate for the high priest. "You shall not," she said as he would have touched her. "One of us shall die before ever your purpose is accomplished." He was close beside her now. His laugh grated upon her ears. "Love does not kill," he replied mockingly. He reached for her arm, and at the same instant something clashed against the bars of one of the windows, crashing them inward to the floor, to be followed almost simultaneously by a human figure which dove headforemost into the room, its head enveloped in the skin window hangings which it carried with it in its impetuous entry. Jane Clayton saw surprise, and something of terror too leaped to the countenance of the high priest, and then she saw him spring forward and jerk upon a leather thong that depended from the ceiling of the apartment. Instantly there dropped from above a cunningly contrived partition that fell between them and the intruder, effectively barring him from them, and at the same time leaving him to grope upon its opposite side in darkness, since the only cresset the room contained was upon their side of the partition. Faintly from beyond the wall Jane heard a voice calling, but whose it was and what the words she could not distinguish. Then she saw Loudon jerk upon another thong and wait in evident expectancy of some consequent happening. He did not have long to wait. She saw the thong move suddenly as though jerked from above, and then Loudon smiled, and with another signal put in motion whatever machinery it was that raised the partition again to its place in the ceiling. Advancing into that portion of the room that the partition had shut off from them, the high priest knelt upon the floor, and down tilting a section of it, revealed the dark mouth of a shaft leading below. Laughing loudly, he shouted into the hole, "Return to thy father, O door al Otho," making fast the catch that prevented the trapdoor from opening beneath the feet of the unwary until such time as Loudon chose. The high priest rose again to his feet. "Now, beautiful one," he cried, and then, "Jadon, what do you hear?" Jane Clayton turned to follow the direction of Loudon's eyes, and there she saw framed in the entrance-way to the apartment the mighty figure of a warrior, upon whose massive features sat an expression of stern and uncompromising authority. "I come from Tarzan," the king replied Jadon, "to remove the beautiful stranger to the forbidden garden." "The king defies me," the high priest of Jad Ben Otho cried Loudon. "It is the king's command I have spoken," snapped Jadon, in whose manner was no sign of either fear or respect for the priest. Loudon well knew why the king had chosen this messenger, whose heresy was notorious, but whose power had as yet protected him from the machinations of the priest. Loudon cast a surreptitious glance at the thongs hanging from the ceiling. Why not? If he could but maneuver to entice Jadon to the opposite side of the chamber. "Come," he said in a conciliatory tone, "let us discuss the matter," and moved toward the spot where he would have Jadon follow him. "There is nothing to discuss," replied Jadon, yet he followed the priest, fearing treachery. Jane watched them. In the face and figure of the warrior she found reflected those admirable traits of courage and honor that the profession of arms best develops. In the hypocritical priest there was no redeeming quality. Of the two, then, she might best choose the warrior. With him there was a chance, with Loudon none. Even the very process of exchange from one prison to another might offer some possibility of escape. She weighed all these things and decided, for Loudon's quick glance at the thongs had not gone unnoticed nor uninterpreted by her. "Warrior," she said, addressing Jadon, "if you would live, enter not that portion of the room." Loudon cast an angry glance upon her. "Silence, slave," he cried. "And where lies the danger?" Jadon asked of Jane, ignoring Loudon. The woman pointed to the thongs. "Look," she said, and before the high priest could prevent, she had seized that which controlled the partition which shot downward, separating Loudon from the warrior and herself. Jadon looked inquiringly at her. "He would have tricked me neatly but for you," he said, "kept me imprisoned there, while he secreted you elsewhere in the mazes of his temple." "He would have done more than that," replied Jane, as she pulled upon the other thong. "This releases the fastenings of a trap door in the floor beyond the partition. When you stepped on that, you would have been precipitated into a pit beneath the temple. Loudon has threatened me with this fate often. I do not know that he speaks the truth, but he says that a demon of the temple is imprisoned there, a huge Graif." "There is a Graif within the temple," said Jadon. "What with it and the sacrifices, the priests keep us busy supplying them with prisoners, though the victims are sometimes those for whom Loudon has conceived hatred among our own people. He has had his eyes upon me for a long time. This would have been his chance but for you. Tell me, woman, why you warned me. Are we not all equally your jailers and your enemies?" "None could be more horrible than Loudon," she replied, "and you have the appearance of a brave and honorable warrior. I could not hope, for hope has died, and yet there is the possibility that among so many fighting men, even though they be of another race than mine, there is one who would accord honorable treatment to a stranger within his gates, even though she be a woman." Jadon looked at her for a long minute. "Tan would make you his queen," he said. "That he told me himself, and surely that were honorable treatment from one who might make you a slave." "Why, then, would he make me queen?" she asked. Jadon came closer, as though in fear his words might be overheard. "He believes, although he did not tell me so in fact, that you are of the race of gods. And why not? Jad Ben Otho is tailless. Therefore it is not strange that Tan should suspect that only the gods are thus. His queen is dead, leaving only a single daughter. He craves a son, and what more desirable than that he should found a line of rulers, for Palil Don descended from the gods." "But I am already wed," cried Jane. "I cannot wed another. I do not want him or his throne." "Tan is king," replied Jadon, simply, as though that explained and simplified everything. "You will not save me then?" she asked. "If you were in Jalur," he replied, "I might protect you even against the king." "What and where is Jalur?" she asked, grasping at any straw. "It is the city where I rule," he answered. "I am chief there, and of all the valley beyond." "Where is it?" she insisted, "and is it far?" "No," he replied, smiling. "It is not far, but do not think of that you could never reach it. There are too many to pursue and capture you, if you wish to know, however. It lies up the river that empties into Jad Ben Lul, whose waters kiss the walls of Allur. Up the western fork it lies, with water upon 3 sides. Impregnable city of Palul-Don, alone of all the cities it has never been entered by a foeman since it was built there, while Jad Ben Otho was a boy." "And there I would be safe?" she asked. "Perhaps," he replied. "Ah, dead hope, upon what slender provocation would you seek to glow again?" She sighed and shook her head, realizing the inutility of hope, yet the tempting bait dangled before her mind's eye. "Jalur." "You are wise," commented Jadon, interpreting her sigh. "Come now, we will go to the quarters of the princess beside the forbidden garden. There you will remain with Oloe, the king's daughter. It will be better than this prison you have occupied." "And Tan?" she asked, a shudder passing through her slender frame. "There are ceremonies," explained Jadon, "that may occupy several days before you become queen, and one of them may be difficult of arrangement." He laughed. "Then what?" she asked. "Only the high priest may perform the marriage ceremony for a king," he explained. "Delay," she murmured, "blessed delay, tenacious indeed of life is hope, even though it be reduced to cold and lifeless char, a veritable phoenix." Chapter 15. The king is dead." As they conversed, Jia had led her down the stone stairway that leads from the upper floors of the Temple of the Grafe to the chambers and the corridors that honeycomb the rocky hills from which the temple and the palace are hewn, and now they passed from one to the other through a doorway upon one side of which 2 priests stood guard and upon the other 2 warriors. The former would have halted Jia when they saw who it was that accompanied him, for well known throughout the temple was the quarrel between king and high priest for possession of this beautiful stranger. Only by order of Ludon may she pass said one, placing himself directly in front of Jane Clayton, barring her progress. Through the hollow eyes of the hideous mask the woman could see those of the priest beneath gleaming with the fires of fanaticism. Jia placed an arm about her shoulders and laid his hand upon his knife. "She passes by order of Ko Tan, the king," he said, "and by virtue of the fact that Jia the chief is her guide, stand aside." The 2 warriors upon the palace side pressed forward. "We are here, Gund of Jia," said one, addressing Jia, "to receive and obey your commands." The second priest now interposed. "Let them pass," he admonished his companion. "We have received no direct commands from Ludon to the contrary, and it is a law of the temple and the palace that chiefs and priests may come and go without interference." "But I know Ludon's wishes," insisted the other. "He told you then that Jia must not pass with the stranger?" "No, but—" "Then let them pass, for they are 3 to 2, and will pass anyway. We have done our best." Grumbling, the priest stepped aside. "Ludon will exact an accounting," he cried angrily. Jia turned upon him. "And get it when and where he will," he snapped. They came at last to the quarters of the Princess Oloa, where, in the main entranceway, loitered a small guard of palace warriors and several stalwart black eunuchs belonging to the princess, or her women. To one of the latter Jia relinquished his charge. "Take her to the princess," he commanded, "and see that she does not escape." Through a number of corridors and apartments lighted by stone cressets, the eunuch led Lady Greystoke, halting at last before a doorway concealed by hangings of Jato skin, where the guide beat with his staff upon the wall beside the door. "Olo, Princess of Palul, he called. "Here is the stranger woman, the prisoner from the temple." "Bid her enter," Jane heard a sweet voice from within command. The eunuch drew aside the hangings and Lady Greystoke stepped within. Before her was a low-ceiled room of moderate size. In each of the 4 corners a kneeling figure of stone seemed to be bearing its portion of the weight of the ceiling upon its shoulders. These figures were evidently intended to represent Wasdon slaves and were not without bold artistic beauty. The ceiling itself was slightly arched to a central dome which was pierced to admit light by day and air. Upon one side of the room were many windows, the other 3 walls being blank except for a doorway in each. The princess lay upon a pile of furs which were arranged over a low stone dais in one corner of the apartment, and was alone except for a single Wasdon slave girl who sat upon the edge of the dais near her feet. As Jane entered, Oloa beckoned her to approach, and when she stood beside the couch the girl half rose upon an elbow and surveyed her critically. "How beautiful you are," she said simply. Jane smiled, sadly, for she had found that beauty may be a curse. "That is indeed a compliment," she replied quickly, "from one so radiant as the Princess Oloa." "Ah," exclaimed the princess delightedly, "you speak my language. I was told that you were of another race and from some far land of which we of Palul have never heard." "Ludon saw to it that the priests instructed me," explained Jane, "but I am from a far country, princess, one to which I long to return, and I am very unhappy." "But Ko Tan, my father, would make you his queen," cried the girl. "That should make you very happy." "But it does not," replied the prisoner. "I love another, to whom I am already wed." "Ah, princess, if you had known what it was to love and to be forced into marriage with another, you would sympathize with me." The Princess Oloa was silent for a long moment. "I know," she said at last, "and I am very sorry for you, but if the king's daughter cannot save herself from such a fate, who may save a slave woman? For such in fact you are." The drinking in the great banquet hall of the palace of Ko Tan, king of Palul, had commenced earlier this night than was usual, for the king was celebrating the morrow's betrothal of his only daughter to Bulot, son of Mosar, the chief, whose great-grandfather had been king of Palul, and who thought that he should be king, and Mosar was drunk, and so was Bulot, his son. For that matter, nearly all of the warriors, including the king himself, were drunk. In the heart of Ko Tan was no love either for Mosar or Bulot, nor did either of these love the king. Tan was giving his daughter to Bulot in the hope that the alliance would prevent Mosar from insisting upon his claims to the throne, for, next to Jadon, Mosar was the most powerful of the chiefs, and while Tan looked with fear upon Jadon too, he had no fear that the old lion man would attempt to seize the throne, though which way he would throw his influence and his warriors in the event that Mosar declare war upon Tan, the king could not guess. Primitive people who are also warlike are seldom inclined toward either tact or diplomacy even when sober, but drunk they know not the words. If aroused, it was really Bulot who started it. This he said, I drink to Oloe, and he emptied his tankard at a single gulp, and this seizing a full one from a neighbor to her son and mine, who will bring back the throne of Pal Uldan to its rightful owners. The king is not yet dead, cried Tan, rising to his feet, nor is Bulot yet married to his daughter, and there is yet time to save Pal Uldan from the spawn of the rabbit breed. The king's angry tone and his insulting reference to Bulot's well-known cowardice brought a sudden, sobering silence upon the roistering company. Every eye turned upon Bulot and Mosar, who sat together directly opposite the king. The first was very drunk, though suddenly he seemed quite sober. He was so drunk that for an instant he forgot to be a coward, since his reasoning powers were so effectually paralyzed by the fumes of liquor that he could not intelligently weigh the consequences of his acts. It is reasonably conceivable that a drunk and angry rabbit might commit a rash deed. Upon no other hypothesis is the thing that Bulot now did explicable. He rose suddenly from the seat to which he had sunk after delivering his toast, and seizing the knife from the sheath of the warrior upon his right hurled it with terrific force at Tan. Skilled in the art of throwing both their knives and their clubs are the warriors of Pal Uldan, and at this short distance, and coming as it did without warning, there was no defense and but one possible result. Tan, the king, lunged forward across the table, the blade buried in his heart. A brief silence followed the assassin's cowardly act. White with terror now, Bulot fell slowly back toward the doorway at his rear, when suddenly angry warriors leaped with drawn knives to prevent his escape and to avenge their king. But Masurisar now took his stand beside his son. Tan is dead, he cried. Mosar is king. Let the loyal warriors of Pal Uldan protect their ruler. Mosar commanded a goodly following, and these quickly surrounded him and Bulot, but there were many knives against them, and now Jadon pressed forward through those who confronted the pretender. Take them both, he shouted. The warriors of Pal Uldan will choose their own king, after the assassin of Tan has paid the penalty of his treachery. Directed now by a leader whom they both respected and admired, those who had been loyal to Tan rushed forward upon the faction that had surrounded Mosar. Fierce and terrible was the fighting, devoid apparently of all else than the ferocious lust to kill, and while it was at its height, Mosar and Bulot slipped unnoticed from the banquet hall. To that part of the palace assigned to them during their visit to Allur they hastened. Here were their servants and the lesser warriors of their party who had not been bidden to the feast of Tan. These were directed quickly to gather together their belongings for immediate departure. When all was ready, and it did not take long, since the warriors of Pal Uldan require but little impedimenta on the march, they moved toward the palace gate. Suddenly Masurisar approached his son. The princess, he whispered. We must not leave the city without her. She is half the battle for the throne. Bulot, now entirely sober, demurred. He had had enough of fighting and of risk. Let us get out of Allur quickly, he urged, or we shall have the whole city upon us. She would not come without a struggle, and that would delay us too long. There is plenty of time, insisted Mosar. They are still fighting in the Pali Donso. It will be long before they miss us, and with Tan dead, long before any will think to look to the safety of the princess. Our time is now. It was made for us by Jad Ben Otho. Come. Reluctantly, Bulot followed his father, who first instructed the warriors to await them just inside the gateway of the palace. Rapidly the two approached the quarters of the princess. Within the entranceway only a handful of warriors were on guard. The eunuchs had retired. There is fighting in the Pali Donso, Mosar announced in feigned excitement as they entered the presence of the guards. The king desires you to come at once and has sent us to guard the apartments of the princess. Make haste, he commanded as the men hesitated. The warriors knew him, and that on the morrow the princess was to be betrothed to Bulot, his son. If there was trouble, what more natural than that Mosar and Bulot should be entrusted with the safety of the princess? And then, too, was not Mosar a powerful chief to whose orders disobedience might prove a dangerous thing? They were but common fighting men disciplined in the rough school of tribal warfare, but they had learned to obey a superior, and so they departed for the banquet hall, the place where men eat. Barely waiting until they had disappeared, Mosar crossed to the hangings at the opposite end of the entrance hall, and followed by Bulot made his way toward the sleeping apartment of Oloe, and a moment later, without warning, the two men burst in upon the three occupants of the room. At sight of them, Oloe sprang to her feet. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded angrily. Mosar advanced and halted before her. Into his cunning mind had entered a plan to trick her. If it succeeded, it would prove easier than taking her by force, and then his eyes fell upon Jane Clayton, and he almost gasped in astonishment and admiration, but he caught himself and returned to the business of the moment. "Oh, Loe," he cried, "when you know the urgency of our mission, you will forgive us. We have sad news for you. There has been an uprising in the palace, and Caotan, the king, has been slain. The rebels are drunk with liquor and now on their way here. We must get you out of Allure at once. There is not a moment to lose. Come, and quickly." "My father dead," cried Oloe, and suddenly her eyes went wide. "Then my place is here with my people," she cried. "If Caotan is dead, I am queen until the warriors choose a new ruler. That is the law of Palul Dawn. And if I am queen, none can make me wed whom I do not wish to wed, and Jad Ben Otho knows I never wished to wed thy cowardly son." She pointed a slim forefinger imperiously toward the doorway. Mosar saw that neither trickery nor persuasion would avail now, and every precious minute counted. He looked again at the beautiful woman who stood beside Oloe. He had never before seen her, but he well knew from palace gossip that she could be no other than the godlike stranger whom Khotan had planned to make his queen. "Bulot," he cried to his son, "take you your own woman, and I will take mine." And with that he sprang suddenly forward, and seizing Jane about the waist, lifted her in his arms. So that before Oloe or Pan at Lee might even guess his purpose, he had disappeared through the hangings near the foot of the dais, and was gone with the stranger woman struggling and fighting in his grasp. And then Bulot sought to seize Oloe, but Oloe had her Pan at Lee, fierce little tiger girl of the savage choral Pan at Lee, whose name belied her, and Bulot found that with the two of them his hands were full. When he would have lifted Oloe and borne her away, Pan at Lee seized him around the legs and strove to drag him down. Viciously he kicked her, but she would not desist, and finally realizing that he might not only lose his princess but be so delayed as to invite capture if he did not rid himself of this clawing, scratching Shijato, he hurled Oloe to the floor, and seizing Pan at Lee by the hair drew his knife, and the curtains behind him suddenly parted. In two swift bounds a lithe figure crossed the room, and before ever the knife of Bulot reached its goal, his wrist was seized from behind, and a terrific blow crashing to the base of his brain dropped him, lifeless, to the floor. Bulot, coward, traitor, and assassin, died without knowing who struck him down. As Tarzan of the Apes leaped into the pool in the grave pit of the temple at Allure, one might have accounted for his act on the hypothesis that it was the last blind urge of self-preservation to delay, even for a moment, the inevitable tragedy in which each someday must play the leading role upon his little stage. But no, those cool, grey eyes had caught the sole possibility for escape, that the surroundings and the circumstances offered a tiny, moonlit patch of water glimmering through a small aperture in the cliff at the surface of the pool upon its farther side. With swift, bold strokes he swam for speed alone, knowing that the water would in no way deter his pursuer. Nor did it. Tarzan heard the great splash as the huge creature plunged into the pool behind him. He heard the churning waters as it forged rapidly onward in his wake. He was nearing the opening. Would it be large enough to permit the passage of his body? That portion of it which showed above the surface of the water most certainly would not. His life then depended upon how much of the aperture was submerged, and now it was directly before him and the graph directly behind. There was no alternative, there was no other hope. The ape-man threw all the resources of his great strength into the last few strokes, extended his hands before him as a cut water, submerged to the water's level, and shot forward toward the hole. Frothing with rage was the baffled Loudon, as he realized how neatly the stranger she had turned his own tables upon him. He could, of course, escape the temple of the grave in which her quick wit had temporarily imprisoned him, but during the delay, however brief, Jadon would find time to steal her from the temple and deliver her to Caotan. But he would have her yet, that the high priest swore in the names of Jad Ben Otho and all the demons of his faith. He hated Khotan. Secretly he had espoused the cause of Mosar, in whom he would have a willing tool. Perhaps then this would give him the opportunity he had long awaited, a pretext for inciting the revolt that would dethrone Khotan and place Mosar in power with Ludon, the real ruler of Palaluldan. He licked his thin lips as he sought the window through which Tarzan had entered, and now Ludon's only avenue of escape. Cautiously he made his way across the floor, feeling before him with his hands, and when they discovered that the trap was set for him, an ugly snarl broke from the priest's lips. "The she-devil," he muttered, "but she shall pay. She shall pay, Jad Ben Alto, how she shall pay for the trick she has played upon Ludon." He crawled through the window and climbed easily downward to the ground. Should he pursue Jadon and the woman, chancing an encounter with the fierce chief, or bide his time until treachery and intrigue should accomplish his design? He chose the latter solution, as might have been expected of such as he. Going to his quarters, he summoned several of his priests, those who were most in his confidence and who shared his ambitions for absolute power of the temple over the palace, all men who hated Khotan. "The time has come," he told them, "when the authority of the temple must be placed definitely above that of the palace. Khotan must make way for Mosar, for Khotan has defied your high priest. Go then, Pan-Sat, and summon Mosar secretly to the temple. And you others go to the city and prepare the faithful warriors that they may be in readiness when the time comes." For another hour they discussed the details of the coup d'etat that was to overthrow the government of Palaluldan. One knew a slave who, as the signal sounded from the temple gong, would thrust a knife into the heart of Khotan for the price of liberty. Another held personal knowledge of an officer of the palace that he could use to compel the latter to admit a number of Ludon's warriors to various parts of the palace. With Missouri-Sar as the cat's paw, the plan seemed scarce possible of failure, and so they separated, going upon their immediate errands to palace and to city. As Pan-Sat entered the palace grounds, he was aware of a sudden commotion in the direction of the Pali Don, and a few minutes later Ludon was surprised to see him return to the apartments of the high priest, breathless and excited. "What now, Pan-Sat?" cried Ludon. "Are you pursued by demons?" "Oh, master, our time has come and gone while we sat here planning. Khotan is already dead and Mosar fled. His friends are fighting with the warriors of the palace, but they have no head, while Jadon leads the others. I could learn but little from frightened slaves who had fled at the outburst of the quarrel. One told me that Bulot had slain the king, and that he had seen Mosar and the assassin hurrying from the palace." Jadon muttered, "The high priest. The fools will make him king if we do not act, and act quickly. Get into the city." Pan-Sat, let your feet fly and raise the cry that Jadon has killed the king and is seeking to wrest the throne from Oloe. Spread the word as you know best how to spread it, that Jadon has threatened to destroy the priests and hurl the altars of the temple into Jad Ben Lul. Rouse the warriors of the city and urge them to attack at once. Lead them into the temple by the secret way that only the priests know, and from here we may spew them out upon the palace before they learn the truth. Go, Pan-Sat, immediately, delay not an instant." "But stay," he called as the under-priest turned to leave the apartment. "Saw or heard you anything of the strange white woman that Jadon stole from the temple of the Grafe, where we have had her imprisoned?" "Only that Jadon took her into the palace, where he threatened the priests with violence if they did not permit him to pass," replied Pan-Sat. "This they told me, but where within the palace she is hidden I know not." "Khotan ordered her to the Forbidden Garden," said Ludon. "Doubtless we shall find her there. And now, Pan-Sat, be upon your errand." In a corridor by Ludon's chamber, a hideously masked priest leaned close to the curtained aperture that led within. Were he listening, he must have heard all that passed between Pan-Sat and the high priest, and that he had listened was evidenced by his hasty withdrawal to the shadows of a nearby passage as the lesser priest moved across the chamber toward the doorway. Pan-Sat went his way in ignorance of the near presence that he almost brushed against as he hurried toward the secret passage that leads from the temple of Jad Ben Otho, far beneath the palace, to the city beyond. Nor did he sense the silent creature following in his footsteps. Chapter 16. The Secret Way. It was a baffled Grafe that bellowed in angry rage as Tarzan's sleek brown body, cutting the moonlit waters, shot through the aperture in the wall of the Grafe pool and out into the lake beyond. The ape-man smiled as he thought of the comparative ease with which he had defeated the purpose of the high priest, but his face clouded again at the ensuing remembrance of the grave danger that threatened his mate. His sole object now must be to return as quickly as he might to the chamber where he had last seen her on the 3rd floor of the Temple of the Grafe, but how he was to find his way again into the temple grounds was a question not easy of solution. In the moonlight he could see the sheer cliff rising from the water for a great distance along the shore, far beyond the precincts of the temple and the palace towering high above him, a seemingly impregnable barrier against his return. Swimming close in, he skirted the wall, searching diligently for some foothold, however slight, upon its smooth, forbidding surface. Above him and quite out of reach were numerous apertures, but there were no means at hand by which he could reach them. Presently, however, his hopes were raised by the sight of an opening level with the surface of the water. It lay just ahead, and a few strokes brought him to it, cautious strokes that brought forth no sound from the yielding waters. At the nearer side of the opening he stopped and reconnoitered. There was no one in sight. Carefully he raised his body to the threshold of the entrance-way, his smooth brown hide glistening in the moonlight as it shed the water in tiny sparkling rivulets. Before him stretched a gloomy corridor, unlighted save for the faint illumination of the diffused moonlight that penetrated it for but a short distance from the opening. Moving as rapidly as reasonable caution warranted, Tarzan followed the corridor into the bowels of the cave. There was an abrupt turn and then a flight of steps, at the top of which lay another corridor running parallel with the face of the cliff. This passage was dimly lighted by flickering cressets set in niches in the walls at considerable distances apart. A quick survey showed the ape-man numerous openings upon each side of the corridor, and his quick ears caught sounds that indicated that there were other beings not far distant, priests, he concluded, in some of the apartments letting upon the passageway. To pass undetected through this hive of enemies appeared quite beyond the range of possibility. He must again seek disguise, and knowing from experience how best to secure such, he crept stealthily along the corridor toward the nearest doorway. Like Numa the lion stalking a wary prey, he crept with quivering nostrils to the hangings that shut off his view from the interior of the apartment beyond. A moment later his head disappeared within, then his shoulders, and his lithe body, and the hangings dropped quietly into place again. A moment later there filtered to the vacant corridor without a brief, gasping gurgle, and again silence. A minute passed, a second, and a third, and then the hangings were thrust aside, and a grimly masked priest of the temple of Jad Ben-Otho strode into the passageway. With bold steps he moved along and was about to turn into a diverging gallery when his attention was aroused by voices coming from a room upon his left. Instantly the figure halted, and crossing the corridor stood with an ear close to the skins that concealed the occupants of the room from him, and him from them. Presently he leapt back into the concealing shadows of the diverging gallery, and immediately thereafter the hangings by which he had been listening parted, and a priest emerged to turn quickly down the main corridor. The eavesdropper waited until the other had gained a little distance, and then stepping from his place of concealment followed silently behind. The way led along the corridor, which ran parallel with the face of the cliff for some little distance, and then Pan sat, taking a cresset from one of the wall niches, turned abruptly into a small apartment at his left. The tracker followed cautiously in time to see the rays of the flickering light dimly visible from an aperture in the floor before him. Here he found a series of steps, similar to those used by the Wasdon in scaling the cliff to their caves, leading to a lower level. First, satisfying himself that his guide was continuing upon his way unsuspecting, the other descended after him and continued his stealthy stalking. The passageway was now both narrow and low, giving but bare headroom to a tall man, and it was broken often by flights of steps leading always downward. The steps in each unit seldom numbered more than 6, and sometimes there was only 1 or 2, but in the aggregate the tracker imagined that they had descended between 50 and 75 feet from the level of the upper corridor when the passageway terminated in a small apartment at one side of, which was a little pile of rubble. Setting his cresset upon the ground, Pan Sat commenced hurriedly to toss the bits of broken stone aside, presently revealing a small aperture at the base of the wall, upon the opposite side of which there appeared to be a further accumulation of rubble. This he also removed until he had a hole of sufficient size to permit the passage of his body. And leaving the cresset still burning upon the floor, the priest crawled through the opening he had made and disappeared from the sight of the watcher hiding in the shadows of the narrow passageway behind him. No sooner, however, was he safely gone than the other followed, finding himself, after passing through the hole, on a little ledge about halfway between the surface of the lake and the top of the cliff above. The ledge inclined steeply upward, ending at the rear of a building which stood upon the edge of the cliff, and which the second priest entered just in time to see Pan Sat pass out into the city beyond. As the latter turned a nearby corner, the other emerged from the doorway and quickly surveyed his surroundings. He was satisfied the priest who had led him hither had served his purpose in so far as the tracker was concerned. Above him, and perhaps 100 yards away the white walls of the palace gleamed against the northern sky. The time that it had taken him to acquire definite knowledge concerning the secret passageway between the temple and the city he did not count as lost, though he begrudged every instant that kept him from the prosecution of his main objective. It had seemed to him, however, necessary to the success of a bold plan that he had formulated upon overhearing the conversation between Loudon and Pan Sat as he stood without the hangings of the apartment of the high priest. Alone against a nation of suspicious and half-savage enemies, he could scarce hope for a successful outcome to the one great issue upon which hung the life and happiness of the creature he loved best. For her sake he must win allies, and it was for this purpose that he had sacrificed these precious moments, but now he lost no further time in seeking to regain entrance to the palace grounds that he might search out whatever new prison they had found in which to incarcerate his lost love. He found no difficulty in passing the guards at the entrance to the palace for, as he had guessed, his priestly disguise disarmed all suspicion. As he approached the warriors, he kept his hands behind him and trusted to fate that the sickly light of the single torch which stood beside the doorway would not reveal his Paluldonian feet. As a matter of fact, so accustomed were they to the comings and goings of the priesthood that they paid scant attention to him, and he passed on into the palace grounds without even a moment's delay. His goal now was the forbidden garden, and this he had little difficulty in reaching, though he elected to enter it over the wall, rather than to chance arousing any suspicion on the part of the guards at the inner entrance, since he could imagine no reason why a priest should seek entrance there thus late at night. He found the garden deserted, nor any sign of her he sought. That she had been brought hither he had learned from the conversation he had overheard between Loudon and Pan Sat, and he was sure that there had been no time or opportunity for the high priest to remove her from the palace grounds. The garden he knew to be devoted exclusively to the uses of the princess and her women, and it was only reasonable to assume therefore that, if Jane had been brought to the garden, it could only have been upon an order from Tan. This being the case, the natural assumption would follow that he would find her in some other portion of Oloai's quarters. Just where these lay he could only conjecture, but it seemed reasonable to believe that they must be adjacent to the garden. So once more he scaled the wall, and passing around its end directed his steps toward an entrance way which he judged must lead to that portion of the palace nearest the forbidden garden. To his surprise he found the place unguarded, and then there fell upon his ear from an interior apartment the sound of voices raised in anger and excitement. Guided by the sound he quickly traversed several corridors and chambers until he stood before the hangings which separated him from the chamber from which issued the sounds of altercation. Raising the skin slightly, he looked within. There were two women battling with a Hodon warrior. One was the daughter of Tan and the other Panat Lee, the Koryulja. At the moment that Tarzan lifted the hangings, the warrior threw Oloa viciously to the ground, and seizing Panat Lee by the hair drew his knife and raised it above her head. Casting the encumbering headdress of the dead priest from his shoulders, the ape-man leaped across the intervening space and, seizing the brute from behind, struck him a single terrible blow. As the man fell forward dead, the two women recognized Tarzan simultaneously. Panat Lee fell upon her knees and would have bowed her head upon his feet had he not, with an impatient gesture, commanded her to rise. He had no time to listen to their protestations of gratitude or answer the numerous questions which he knew would soon be flowing from those two feminine tongues. "Tell me," he cried, "where is the woman of my own race whom Don brought here from the temple?" "She is but this moment gone," cried Oloai. "Mosar, the father of this thing here," and she indicated the body of Bulot with a scornful finger, seized her and carried her away. "Which way?" he cried. "Tell me quickly in what direction he took her." "That way," cried Panat Lee, pointing to the doorway through which Mosar had passed. "They would have taken the princess and the stranger woman to Tulur, Mosar's city by the dark lake." "I go to find her," he said to Panat Lee. "She is my mate, and if I survive I shall find means to liberate you too and return you to Amat." Before the girl could reply, he had disappeared behind the hangings of the door near the foot of the dais. The corridor through which he ran was illy lighted, and like nearly all its kind in the Hodon city, wound in and out and up and down, but at last it terminated at a sudden turn which brought him into a courtyard filled with warriors. A portion of the palace guard that had just been summoned by one of the lesser palace chiefs to join the warriors of Tan in the battle that was raging in the banquet hall. And at sight of Tarzan, who in his haste had forgotten to recover his disguising headdress, a great shout arose. Blasphemer, defiler of the temple burst hoarsely from savage throats, and mingling with these were a few who cried Doro Oloto. evidencing the fact that there were among them still some who clung to their belief in his divinity. To cross the courtyard armed only with a knife in the face of this great throng of savage fighting men seemed even to the giant ape-man a thing impossible of achievement. He must use his wits now, and quickly too, for they were closing upon him. He might have turned and fled back through the corridor, but flight now, even in the face of dire necessity, would but delay him in his pursuit of Mosar and his mate. "Stop," he cried, raising his palm against them. "I am the Doro-Olotho, and I come to you with a word from Jadon, who it is my father's will shall be your king now that Khotan is slain. Ludon, the high priest, has planned to seize the palace and destroy the loyal warriors that Mosar may be made King Mosar, who will be the tool and creature of Ludon. Follow me. There is no time to lose if you would prevent the traitors whom Ludon has organized in the city from entering the palace by a secret way and overpowering Jadon and the faithful band within." For a moment they hesitated. At last one spoke. "What guarantee have we," he demanded, "that it is not you who would betray us and by leading us now away from the fighting in the banquet hall cause those who fight at Jadon's side to be defeated?" "My life will be your guarantee," replied Tarzan. "If you find that I have not spoken the truth, you are sufficient in numbers to execute whatever penalty you choose. But come, there is not time to lose. Already are the lesser priests gathering their warriors in the city below." And without waiting for any further parley, he strode directly toward them in the direction of the gate upon the opposite side of the courtyard, which led toward the principal entrance to the palace ground. Slower in wit than he, they were swept away by his greater initiative and that compelling power which is inherent to all natural leaders, and so they followed him, the giant ape-man with a dead tail dragging the ground behind him, a demigod where another would have been ridiculous. Out into the city he led them, and down toward the unpretentious building that hid Ludon's secret passageway from the city to the temple. And as they rounded the last turn, they saw before them a gathering of warriors which was being rapidly augmented from all directions as the traitors of Allur mobilized at the call of the priesthood. "You spoke the truth, stranger," said the chief who marched at Tarzan's side, "for there are the warriors with the priests among them, even as you told us." "And now," replied the ape-man, "that I have fulfilled my promise, I will go my way after Mosar, who has done me a great wrong. Tell Jadon that Jad Ben Otho is upon his side, nor do you forget to tell him also that it was the Dor-Il Otho who thwarted Ludon's plan to seize the palace." "I will not forget," replied the chief. "Go your way. We are enough to overpower the traitors." "Tell me," asked Tarzan, "how I may know this city of Tulur." "It lies upon the south shore of the second lake below Allur," replied the chief, "the lake that is called Jad in Lul." They were now approaching the band of traitors who evidently thought that this was another contingent of their own party, since they made no effort either toward defense or retreat. Suddenly the chief raised his voice in a savage war cry that was immediately taken up by his followers, and simultaneously, as though the cry were a command, the entire party broke into a mad charge upon the surprised rebels. Satisfied with the outcome of his suddenly conceived plan and sure that it would work to the disadvantage of Ludon, Tarzan turned into a side street and pointed his steps toward the outskirts of the city in search of the trail that led southward toward Tulur.